Hey guys, John from Bike Fit Advisor. So many people come into the studio for fitting, and one of the first things out of their mouth is, I know I need a new saddle. And this is an understandable tendency, especially when a part of the bike, like the seat, is giving us so much trouble that, you know, it's normal to want to address it very aggressively. But when you're doing a fitting, changing the saddle is often the last thing you want to do. Literally, the last thing sometimes. And here's why. And now I've mentioned this in the past, but it definitely bears repeating. So the reason we change the saddle sometimes as a last resort is because the saddle comfort is dependent on basically the whole system. There's a pretty complex interaction with the hands, the hips, and then the feet in order to provide the right balance. And by balance, I mean a couple of different things. I mean how your weight is distributed through the contact points and how your weight is distributed over the bike. And we really need to address all these other factors first and make sure that they are properly set before we start making equipment changes, especially with the saddle replacement. Now, yes, there are definitely situations where I do swap out saddles, and sometimes on the first visit. But it's more rare than not. Many times we'll actually give what the person is riding, unless I'm certain that the shape of it is not suitable for this person at all. We'll kind of give it a shot and change everything else to make sure that we've optimized things there before we change it. And that's generally how I would approach it, is address everything else and then start swapping in saddles, because then you get a real comparison as to whether it's improving things or not. If you're still fighting with the bike fit itself, then you won't know if the saddle's the problem or the rest of the fit is the problem. So here are the three most common causes for saddle discomfort that I see come in. And it may be interesting to know that the improper shape of the saddle or selection of the saddle is not one of the top three. Misplaced handlebars are the #1 cause of saddle discomfort that I see. When they are not in the right position, they can be either too high or too low, too long or too short. Any of those things can create saddle problems. And when they're not when the bars aren't placed correctly, it has a tendency to draw the pelvis either into more anterior pelvic tilt, which can decrease the stability of the pelvis, because most people have a certain angle that is most stable for them, and this sometimes happens in tandem with the pelvis actually sliding forward on the saddle. And then when that happens, now we're sitting on a slightly narrower section of the seat, which definitely creates problems. When our wider sit bones are on a narrower section, we're going to be bearing weight on the soft tissues. #2 is not bearing the proper amount of weight through the feet. One cause for not being able to bear enough weight through the feet is when the cleats are misplaced. And when we can't bear or take enough weight throughout the pedal stroke through our feet, then that weight has to go somewhere. It's going to go to the seat and it's going to go to the hands. And we're basically unbalancing the weight distribution we have, and so that the hips and the pelvis are going to take more weight than they're intended to. #3, the third cause for saddle discomfort I see is when the hips are too far forward. And it really matters where the hips are relative to the feet. When there is not a proper balance between the horizontal distance between where our hips and where our feet line up on the bike, we'll lose some stability through the pelvis. It can cause the pelvis to move in an unstable way, or it just causes it to not be as stable on the saddle, and it can lead to the hips bearing weight in the wrong place on the seat, as well as increasing the shear forces, or sort of the friction that we feel that as we move over the saddle. Now, we've taken each of these individually, but I can't stress enough that really we see all three factors. We see, you know, the positioning of the hands, the hips, and the feet. The way that they're integrated together is exceptionally important. And a perfect example of this was a client I had in last week, where they were kind of the trifecta of problems for the saddle. This rider, she was not bearing a proper amount of weight. She didn't have enough weight through her feet. Her hips were too far forward relative to where her feet are positioned, and she was actually bearing too much weight on her hands, and her reach was too long for her. Now, it might seem like this person was a train wreck, but actually her position was not that far off. What I ended up having to do was we actually shortened the stem, and we had to do so fairly aggressively. But when I shortened the reach of the bike, it actually cleared up many of the problems for us. It was almost like killing 3 birds with 1 stone. Because when we shortened the reach through the stem and got her hands back, she was able to then slide back on the saddle to a wider portion of it. And now she was bearing weight and had a stable pelvic posture because everything kind of agreed with her shoulder angle, and she had sort of a good stable platform up top to work from. And because we had gotten her hips further back in the saddle, now we got her hips back further behind her feet, and she was actually now bearing better weight through her feet as well. We kind of solved all 3 problems with 1 change. I will say this is kind of rare. Usually the fixes for these things are small bits of all the contact points changing a little bit. Now this client did notice a pretty pronounced effect on her saddle comfort even when she was in here, but what I did is I actually sent her out to ride for a couple of weeks and get used to the new position, let her body settle into this new setup, and then she's going to come back. And at that point, if we're still having some saddle problems, and potentially even if we're not, we still may experiment with swapping the saddle out to try a couple of different shapes and see if anything is better than what she currently has. But at least now I know that we have now sort of solved some of the other fit problems that were contributing to the saddle discomfort, and we're kind of safer to, change the saddle out and be able to isolate that as a variable now. So that's all I have for this one. Thanks everybody. I will see you in a couple of days for my next video.